Imagine a winter night, somewhere along the Missouri River, 1832, a Mandan village, firelight flickering against the snow. A fur trader slides a jug across a blanket. The elder looks at it. He's seen these before. He knows what happens the morning after. But the trader smiles, and the deal gets done. And by the time that village sees another decade, half the people who sat around that fire are gone. Not from a battle, not from a raid, from something far quieter, far more deliberate. Here's the thing nobody tells you in the history books. The most effective weapon ever deployed against Native American civilization didn't have a trigger. It didn't require a single soldier. It was poured into a cup, and the people who poured it knew exactly what they were doing. Welcome to Frontier Uncensored. I'm your host, Dustin, and today we're diving into one of the darkest and most deliberately buried chapters of American history. How substances, from alcohol to opium to pharmaceutical drugs in government institutions, were systematically weaponized to dismantle, destabilize, and ultimately destroy Native American communities from the inside out. If that sounds like a bold claim, stick with me, because the historical record is as clear as it is disturbing. And before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and the bell. This is the kind of history that deserves an audience. Let's go back to the very beginning of contact. When European ships first made landfall on the eastern seaboard, the indigenous peoples of North America had built civilizations spanning thousands of years, complex trade networks, sophisticated governance, deep spiritual traditions tied to the land itself. These were not primitive societies stumbling towards civilization. These were fully realized cultures, and that made them resistant to displacement. Resistant to religious conversion, resistant to colonial control. That resistance was the problem European powers had to solve. Military conquest worked in some places. Disease, tragically, did the rest in others. But there was a third strategy, one that unfolded more slowly, more insidiously, and with deliberate intention. And it started, as so many colonial enterprises did, with trade. The fur trade was the economic engine of early colonial North America. Beaver pelts, fox furs, deer hides, they were worth fortunes in European markets, and Native Americans were the best hunters on the continent. They knew the land, they knew the animals, they were indispensable to the operation. So, early European traders had to offer something in return. And among the goods they brought, beads, iron tools, textiles. One item stood apart for its effect on the human brain: alcohol. Now, here's what's important to understand. This wasn't simply about European traders introducing a new social lubricant. Indigenous peoples had their own ceremonial use of certain plants and fermented drinks in some cultures. But the distilled spirits that Europeans brought, rum, whiskey, brandy, these were categorically different. High proof, dependency-forming, and completely outside the cultural frameworks that indigenous communities had developed over centuries to manage intoxicants. The first encounters with European spirits were often described by indigenous observers themselves as a kind of spirit possession, something that overtook a person and made them unrecognizable. And yet, once introduced into communities through trade, it spread rapidly. But here is where the story shifts from tragic accident to something far more calculated. And this is the question I want you to sit with for the next few minutes. If colonial traders and government officials genuinely cared about the welfare of indigenous peoples, and some claim to, why did alcohol remain the single most consistent trade commodity on the American frontier for over 200 years? Quote, why was it restocked faster than food? End quote. Why were liquor licenses on reservation borders granted before schools were built? We'll get to the answer. But first, let's understand exactly what happened when alcohol hit these communities. The physiological and social consequences were catastrophic. Without the multi-generational cultural frameworks that European societies had developed around drinking, many indigenous communities had no inherited social codes for managing its effects. There was no village elder tradition that said, this is how much is appropriate, this is when you stop. Alcoholism took root fast. And when it did, it attacked the structural pillars of indigenous society from multiple directions simultaneously. Violence increased, family bonds fractured, hunting, farming, and the seasonal rhythms that sustained communities were disrupted. Spiritual ceremonies were abandoned or corrupted. And critically, the political decision-making capacity of tribal leadership was compromised at exactly the moments when those leaders needed to be at their sharpest. Moments like treaty negotiations. This is not speculation. The historical record is filled with colonial officials and traders openly discussing in letters and journals how alcohol could be used to soften a tribe before a land deal. Henry Leavenworth, An American military officer writing in the 1820s described with clinical detachment how whiskey could smooth the way for territorial cessions. British officers in the Great Lakes region maintained deliberate supply lines of rum to key tribal intermediaries during the Revolutionary period, not as gifts, as strategy. There's a moment from 1775 that encapsulates the whole logic of this approach. British Lieutenant Colonel Henry Bouquet distributed contaminated rum to Native American fighters during operations in the Ohio Valley. The result was not just intoxication. It was incapacitation at a moment of military vulnerability. The frontier was not just conquered with rifles. It was conquered with barrels. And this is the part that should make every American rethink the word trade. Because what was being traded was not just goods. It was sovereignty, land rights, cultural continuity. All of it exchanged for a substance that, once dependency took hold, made clear thinking nearly impossible. By the early 19th century, the pattern was so well established that even some members of Congress acknowledged it openly. The Indian Trade and Intercourse Act of 1817 technically prohibited the sale of alcohol to Native Americans. But here's the brutal truth about that legislation. It was almost never enforced. In the territories where it mattered most, along the Missouri, across the Great Plains, through the Pacific Northwest, traders continued to operate with near total impunity. The law existed on paper. The whiskey flowed in reality. Now, before I go further, I want to ask you something directly, because this is where history stops being just history and starts being a mirror. If a foreign government had done this to American citizens, what would we call it? Let me know in the comments, because I think the answer matters. Let's move forward in time, because alcohol was only the first chapter. By the mid-19th century, the opioid trade had transformed global economics. The British Empire had already fought 2 wars to protect its right to sell opium to China. The drug was profitable, it was portable, and it created guaranteed long-term customers. And as the fur trade pushed deeper into North America, opium traveled with it. The introduction of opium to indigenous communities followed a similar pattern to alcohol, but with some key differences. Initially, it was framed as medicine, and in fairness, it genuinely was used for pain relief in the 1800s across all of American society. But the Hudson Bay Company and other trading enterprises operating in indigenous territories recognized quickly that opium created a dependency that alcohol could not always sustain. A community that grew wary of whiskey traders could still be reached through medicine. The deliberate supply of opium to tribal communities, documented in trading, post-ledgers, and missionary reports from the period, served a dual purpose. It generated profit, and it created a dependency that made resistance increasingly difficult to organize. When the leaders of a community are managing addiction, when families are fractured by the fog of opioid withdrawal and the desperate search for the next supply, political mobilization becomes nearly impossible. The consequences were severe and compounding. Opium addiction weakened immune systems, making communities more vulnerable to the epidemics of tuberculosis, smallpox, and cholera that swept through indigenous populations during the same period. It disrupted the agricultural and hunting cycles that sustained food supplies, and it created what we would today recognize as a public health crisis, but one deliberately engineered rather than accidental. Some indigenous healers and community leaders recognized what was happening and fought back with extraordinary courage. Spiritual revivals led by figures like the Shawnee prophet Tenskwatawa in the early 1800s specifically targeted alcohol and substance dependency as spiritual contamination, a corruption brought from outside that had to be rejected for the community to survive. These movements spread across multiple tribal nations and represent some of the most remarkable grassroots public health campaigns in American history. But here's the contradiction that history books almost never address. These resistance movements were met not with respect or support, but with suppression. The Hudson Bay Company and American territorial officials actively undermined leaders who tried to reduce substance dependency in their communities, because a sober, organized indigenous population was, from the colonial perspective, a dangerous one. Think about that for a moment. The people trying to protect their communities from addiction were treated as threats to colonial order, while the people flooding those communities with addictive substances were treated as legitimate businessmen. Now we arrive at perhaps the most disturbing chapter of this entire story, and I'll be honest with you, this one is hard to talk about, but it needs to be said. The latter half of the 19th century saw the formalization of American government policy toward indigenous peoples take a specific and brutal shape. The solution to what politicians called the Indian problem was not military annihilation, though that continued in various forms. The solution was cultural erasure, and the primary instrument of that erasure was the boarding school system. Beginning in the 1870s and accelerating through the early 20th century, the United States government, working alongside various religious organizations, established a network of boarding schools specifically designed to remove Native American children from their families, their languages, and their cultures. The stated goal, expressed without apology by figures like Captain Richard Henry Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian School, was to kill the Indian, save the man, strip away everything indigenous, replace it with European American identity. Children as young as 5 years old were taken, sometimes voluntarily surrendered by parents who were threatened with loss of rations if they refused, sometimes forcibly removed by government agents. They were transported hundreds of miles from home. Their hair was cut, their traditional clothing was confiscated. Their languages were forbidden, on pain of punishment ranging from the denial of food to physical discipline. And here is where the substance story intersects with the boarding school era in a way that is still not fully understood by most Americans. Within these institutions, medications and chemical agents were used as tools of behavioral control. Children who resisted assimilation, who spoke their native languages, who tried to maintain cultural practices, were sometimes administered sedatives to make them compliant. The medical records that survive from this period, and many were deliberately destroyed, indicate patterns of medication that go far beyond any legitimate therapeutic purpose. Laudanum, a widely available opium-based tincture, was used in these institutions. Early barbiturates appeared later in the system's existence. These were not compassionate medical interventions. They were instruments of suppression applied to children whose only crime was holding on to who they were. The long-term consequences of the boarding school system are still being excavated, literally and figuratively. Mass graves have been discovered at former school sites in recent years. The psychological trauma of forced cultural separation, compounded by physical and sometimes sexual abuse, created what researchers now recognize as transgenerational trauma, a wound that passes through generations, not just through memory, but through neurological and epigenetic pathways. And here's the open loop that takes us to the present, because this is where the history becomes impossible to separate from the headlines. The communities that endured deliberate alcoholization in the 17th and 18th centuries, then deliberate opioid introduction in the 19th, then pharmaceutical suppression in boarding schools through the 20th, those same communities today face substance abuse rates that are dramatically higher than the national average. Native Americans experience alcohol-related deaths at more than twice the rate of any other demographic group in the United States. Opioid dependency is a crisis in reservation communities across the country. Mental health challenges tied to intergenerational trauma are pervasive and deeply under-resourced. This is not coincidence. This is continuity. The crisis of today is the consequence of policy from yesterday. And until that historical chain of causation is acknowledged at the highest levels of American civic life, the interventions being applied today will continue to miss the mark. Because here is what the data tells us about effective treatment for substance dependency in indigenous communities. Programs that incorporate cultural reconnection, traditional practices, indigenous language, ceremony, relationship to land, dramatically outperform standard clinical approaches. Sobriety is not just a medical achievement. For these communities, it is an act of cultural reclamation, a continuation of the resistance that leaders like Tenskwatawa represented 2 centuries ago. Do you think that kind of culturally grounded healing should be funded at the federal level? That's a serious question, not a rhetorical one. I'd genuinely like to know what you think in the comments below. Now, before we close out, I want to pull back and give you the big picture. Because individual stories, the trader with the whiskey jug, the boarding school administrator with the laudanum, the territorial official who looked the other way while opium moved through his jurisdiction, these are not isolated characters. They're points in a connected line of deliberate strategy. The use of addictive substances against Native American communities was not a series of accidents. It was not the unintended consequence of good faith trade. In the cases that are best documented, it was conscious, calculated, and defended explicitly by the people who implemented it. The logic was simple and ruthless. A community struggling with addiction cannot mount effective political or military resistance. A generation raised in boarding schools under chemical suppression will not transmit its culture to the next. And a people disconnected from their language, their ceremonies, and their land will eventually become, in the coldest colonial terminology, manageable. What makes this history so important to understand in 2026 is not just its darkness. It is its relevance to ongoing debates about indigenous sovereignty, tribal governance, healthcare funding, and the reparations conversation that continues to evolve across American political life. The Mandan elder, sitting by that Missouri River fire in 1832, understood something intuitively that it took mainstream American historiography another century and a half to begin acknowledging. That what was being offered across that trade blanket was not a gift. It was a slow siege. And the most extraordinary thing about this entire history is not the cruelty of the people who implemented it. It's the resilience of the people who survived it. Across 2 centuries of deliberate chemical warfare, the forced separation of children from parents, of the systematic dismantling of cultural structures that had sustained civilization for thousands of years, Native American communities held on. Language preservation movements are thriving. Cultural practices are being reclaimed. Tribal colleges are producing graduates who carry both modern education and deep indigenous knowledge. Addiction recovery programs rooted in ceremony and community are demonstrating results that clinical medicine alone cannot achieve. That survival is not a footnote, it is the headline. And it demands something from the rest of us, not guilt. Guilt is passive. It demands understanding. The understanding that what is sometimes framed as a social problem, high rates of addiction and poverty in reservation communities, is in fact a political outcome. The result of policies that were designed, implemented, and defended by the American government over generations. Recognizing that distinction does not just change how we understand the past. It changes what solutions are even possible in the present. We started this video on a winter night along the Missouri River. A fire, a jug, a smile across a trade blanket. It looked like commerce. It was something else entirely. And the truth of what it was has been sitting in the historical record all along, waiting for someone to read it clearly and say it out loud. That's what we do here at Frontier Uncensored. If this story hit you the way it hit me when I first went deep into the sources, share it. Send it to someone who thinks history is just names and dates, because this is what history actually is. Its consequences, its policy, its people who made decisions that rippled forward into the lives of people living right now. Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next, and drop a comment below. Tell me, was there a moment in today's video that genuinely surprised you? Because this history surprised me.